Copperberg Conversations on manufacturing matters, where industry questions meet expert answers. Welcome to the Copperberg Conversation table. Here, we'll dive into the latest insights on manufacturing. So settle in and let's get this conversation going.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Copperberg Conversations on Manufacturing Matters. I'm your host, Nina Roper-Yearwood, Social Media Manager at Copperberg. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of knowledge exchange in manufacturing. And who better to explore this with than Lisa Hellqvist? Lisa co-founded Copperberg back in 2012 and has been our managing director ever since. With over 15 years of experience in the industry, she's a true expert on all things related to the industrial aftermarket, service, e-commerce, and digitization. Over the past decade, Lisa has become a well-known figure in the field, consistently engaging with manufacturers and creating original content that resonates across the industry. In addition to her extensive experience, Lisa holds an MBA in Business Administration, Economics, and Marketing from Stockholm University, as well as a bachelor's degree in International Business Administration from Sureten University. Today, we're going to tap into Lisa's wealth of knowledge to discuss the dynamics of knowledge exchange, both internally within a company and externally with industry partners and maybe even competitors. How do you find that sweet spot where the benefits of knowledge exchange outweigh the risks? That's what we're going to find out. So, first, let's welcome and get to know our expert guest in today's episode. Hello, Lisa. Welcome to the show. Lisa, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and what we do here at Copperberg?
Oh, thank you, Nina, and thank you for having me. This is definitely a first time for me being on our very own podcast as well. It feels a bit. Normally, I'm on the other side, right? So this is a bit
Yeah.
weird for me to be able to just follow your lead. So let's see how I will do. Yeah, what is Copperberg? As you mentioned, we founded in this organization in 2012. We basically broke out from the mother organization back then that was focusing on multiple cross-industry events and multiple verticals within the events industry. We did trade shows, we did BI events, IT security, mobile health, you name it. But we had, let's say, a dedicated team that specialized a lot on the aftermarket and service function over the last couple of years before heading up or leading into 2012. And we just saw that was its own think tank. It had its own kind of life and it had its own sort of loyal community. And that led us to, decide that we should break this portfolio of events and community out of the sort of mother company. And we should, start not anew, but start our own business with that as a dedicated focus, mainly to get the true mind share. And I think that in one sense will be quite interesting looking at what we're going to discuss today. But we were doing it almost solemnly to be able to have a dedicated team that could exchange knowledge over the table. So that's how we started. And I mean, of course, the mother company, this was a joint decision with the mother company, and the mother company still, stayed as majority owners of Copperberg. So it was a very amicable split and one that was tactical in terms of strategy. Because it was different kind of business methodology between the two companies. So that's how it all started. And then, here we are, 15 years later. God, it's not 15, but it's 12 years later. It feels like 15 at times. But I started 15 years ago in the group of companies. And I mean, Copperberg has come to be an expert original content creation company, and we specialize in the manufacturing sector, predominantly on aftermarket services, field service, spare parts, e-com, and you name it, right? So that's where we thrive, I would say. Of course, we branch out to related topics such as supply chain, IIoT, enterprise asset management, etc. But this is still where our core competence is. And when I say original content creation, we both do online media, publishing, almost act like a marketing agency for many of our partners and community members, as well as we create, educational content through virtual academies and in-person events across Europe. So that's basically Copperberg.
Mhm.
And then me, what am I? I'm born and raised out of Sweden. I live with my husband and my 3.5-year-old outside of Stockholm, in a very sort of family-friendly neighborhood. And this has been my home since I was born, Stockholm city. So I don't think I will move from here. I just turned 40, so I'm starting to get a bit older. I was fairly young when I started in this industry, and I spend my days. I try to work out as much as possible, even though I have a toddler at home. I try to read books as much as possible. Audiobooks has become my lifesaver with the commute into the office. And I try to meet as many friends as possible. That's something that became important after the pandemic, I think more. I miss them. So, now I try to meet up with them.
Wow, so many related points there in terms of what we're gonna be discussing today. So we know that there's a lot to gain from collaborating and sharing ideas, but there's also a risk of losing your competitive edge, both from within your organization as an employee and opening up your hard-earned best practices to the industry at large, like what we do at
Mhm.
Copperberg, like sharing best
Yeah.
practices. So I'd love to get your perspective on how this dynamic plays out in our industry, because we often talk about how crucial it is to share knowledge within teams, especially in fast paced areas like field service. And we've covered it extensively
Yeah.
over the decade. But it's not always
Mhm.
easy to get those systems in place, right?
No.
From what you've seen, what are the biggest hurdles companies face when trying to set up effective internal knowledge sharing systems?
It's an extremely tough question, but a good one, I would say. One of the things that I think, if I take it more on like the industrial level now, taking larger companies into consideration, I would say that one of the most crucial things to get over is to not rely on technology. It's very easy that we say, oh, we need the data accumulation. We have a system that is supposed to capture this, and we ask our employees to fill this out and forms and etc. Right? Which is all brilliant. It's great that you have the infrastructure for capturing this kind of data, right? To be able to, transfer knowledge across departments, across generations. You don't want the aging workforce to maybe leave the company without being able to pick their brain truly and have that sort of knowledge retention that you need, right?
Mhm,
But it's not a system thing, it's a company culture thing. So
mhm,
unless you have a company culture that actually fosters and embraces knowledge sharing across age groups, across departmental groups, whatever it might be, right? You would never foster culture where you can capture these nuances either,
mhm,
because people would just do them as homework. But the real true sort of soft values will not be captured, because that's what's bringing the edge to your data, right?
mhm,
Data today is quite easy to even automate, even through AI, fill in the gaps,
mhm,
because it's you can be pulled from different systems. But it is that human aspect of the data that I think is very important that we somehow transfer and somehow
mhm.
keep. Um, so you need to build a company culture where this is transferred from one part of the organization to another, so that there is a willingness to share, right? You know, and I also think it is an excellent, if you take a new recruit, for example. So you have someone, a newbie on the team. Maybe you pair them up with a more older colleague, a more senior colleague that has been there for ages. One of the things that needs to be embraced in that instant is obviously also that the older colleague has that golden opportunity, because they are like what we say, tabla rasa, right? They're a blank page, right? You have the golden opportunity to shape this new recruit with these intangible aspects of your company culture and the narrative that your company stands for, that isn't necessarily, it never goes into fine print. It's between the lines, right? So it could be things like, how you treat your customers with a certain level of compassion, or we always do this, or I know this about this. And this is never captured unless you have an exchange, right? And it's also a great way of making sure that new recruits understands, the flavor, if that makes sense, the talk of the town, of the company,
Yeah.
and they can then mirror that, right? So I think it's very important. And by also sharing those small snippets of information, you are also building a foundation of trust. And that is what's required if someone, let's say, then on the other end of it might be that a new recruit makes a mistake, and he or she needs to confess this. Then you want to have that solid sort of foundation of trust to be able to coach them out of that and make sure that's prevented in the future, right? But if you think that confessing such a thing is, associated with guilt and blame and etc., then of course you're not going to have the same open style communication, right? You might dodge the bullet and try to hide. I think thinking of this question, I mean, let's say the police force, the uniforms that goes in the patrol cars. I know for a fact that in many countries, it's very common that a more senior member is taking some of the new recruits out, in the cars for the first kind of patrol shift. And then they also tell them all these secrets of different, neighborhoods, different corners. It might be well-known figures that they drive by, things to keep an eye on, who is a friendly person, even though they might, be in that area or whatever. So they share this kind of information that's not anywhere to be found. But it's extremely important for someone who's new to be able to navigate through their daily lives, right? So it's one of the things that I think the hurdle is to create a culture that is encouraging this kind of exchange, right? So I always say, you give some, you gain some. So it's true in this instance. It's like if you always have to lead by example. And I think you're probably going to ask me about the leadership later on, but I think it's really there. You have to be transparent and you need to foster
Because
culture.
I was wondering about this, Lisa, because I mean, in theory, it's it's really nice and well to think about it in that way. But of course, to more senior ones, it doesn't always come naturally to them because these are knowledge that they think that they have that they probably don't think about a lot. You know what I mean? Like they just know the ways of the trade.
Yeah.
If you've been a field service technician for over a decade or 2 decades, very senior in your role, you just know how to do things efficiently, and you probably don't have it in your head in a step-by-step basis. So you were talking about an organization building a culture where people can share that, and it supports that kind of knowledge transfer and exchange. So can you give some examples, paint us a picture of manufacturers, OEMs that you've seen, or any other companies that you have interacted with, which you think have been very successful in this kind of approach?
That's a great question. I must say, I've seen seen plenty, right? So naming exact names, then I might actually misname them. So I'm going to stay away from that. But recalling some of the last couple of events we've done and the last couple of webinars I broadcasted, what I see that seems to be a trend is that many senior leaders, they actually assign cross-departmental work groups, right? Where you have different stakeholders in the organization that are crucial for, especially if some kind of transformation project is going on. That's normally where this becomes extremely important, that we have this kind of spontaneous knowledge share. And it's also extremely important when we're trying to capture the aging workforce knowledge. So those are the two instances where this is extremely critical for success, right? So I've seen the common denominator with these leaders is that they assign some kind of work group that has a cross-departmental representation in it. Quite diverse groups also, so it has an interesting dynamic from the beginning. That's often quite the case as well. And what it does is that it has this two-folded effect, right? Because once they get appointed and requested as ambassadors of this change project, but they're also then feeling to some extent somewhat recognized, right? Because now their voice is getting heard, so they get a seat at the table, which is a positive thing, right? And then also they are often, the ambassadors of certain things, which means that they already have a certain drive, and a will to change things. So it is normally there's a positive vibe in these groups. I've heard, unfortunately, horror stories, of course, where it becomes one long Dr. Phil session and like a blame game between departments. That's not the point of this. I think one of the key aspects is also to have a very clear vision and goal with this specific work group, right? So for example, I've heard many using the agile methodology of like scrum meetings, there's sprints, there are very clear definitions of what this work group should do on a very given sort of time frame. Many are also relying on what we call the sort of SMART objective and goal structure, which is, of course, that it should be, specific, it should be measurable. Help me now, Nina. It should be achievable,
specific, achievable,
relevant,
time bound,
and time bound. Yeah, that's the SMART. Sorry, it's afternoon here. I need to go. No. And I think that's very clear. Also, it's also that's something we have to do to get also. Everyone feels good if they know what's expected of them, and if they can achieve that, right? So then people become contributors, right? I think where we get lost in this kind of knowledge sharing is where it becomes one long, therapeutic session, and there's no real action behind this knowledge share. Then that's just a testimonial somehow. So I think it's important to capture this also in also different kind of memos, PMs, but then also, of course, having all the stakeholders heard, because that's important to create that inclusiveness where people would like to start sharing as well.
So in terms of incentivizing this, because that's what I get from what you've said so far, it's really incentivizing the sharing part for the more senior ones, and to make essentially the knowledge flow across. Is it really just recognition there, or is there more to it as well in terms of motivating the more senior ones to share the best practices that they've got in their pockets, that they've collected for so many years?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, of course, I think it's a mix, but I don't think it's a lie to say that there's a huge chunk of recognition in these kind of things, right? Because we all, I mean, it might not be a professional recognition thing, but it's, the human being is also, a group animal. Like, we live in packs, right? So we like our own groups. And of course we want to be, liked by the own group. So, if we have a reason to shine or being liked, we will probably jump on that possibility. It's in our instincts. So I think a part of it is getting recognized. And especially if you have a long, career in your back, I think it's really important that you also get heard, because you do have a lot of insights. What sometimes can be when you have unfortunately failed to foster, a culture of change, for example, is that people who has done something 10 years ago was to say, we tried that, it didn't work. And then they kind of lock themselves and they don't really share, right? And that's one of the everyone who's gone through a change project knows that this is the case. You have people in it who said, oh, but I already did that didn't work. And that's also something that the leadership has to work with, right? To have them. And I think it's all about a little bit getting underneath the surface. Even, it's almost like a therapy session, to use that again, but it's almost like, you scratch the surface a bit, you might get some resistance, but then you keep on digging, and there is maybe a story that needs to be unraveled underneath, and you can have learning points from it. So, I mean, keep on digging.
Yeah. So I'm in the process of digging out this knowledge. I'm really curious, and I'm going to throw this question at you, because I also want to imagine, and maybe to our listeners out there, in terms of breaking down the silos, who are the people involved here? Who are the actors that we expect to play a role?
I mean, ultimately, I'm 100% sure it boils down to leadership here, even if it's departmental or if it's top management. I think it's extremely important that any organization, breaking down the silos for me means that you've set your organization in very sort of vertical, silo departments where there's very limited information flow. And what you want to do is cross that, right? You want to bridge that gap. Number one is the question, why should that gap be bridged? What is it that we want to achieve with bridging the gap? And that ultimately always comes back to the leadership, right? So there's something within the leadership or from top level management that has been decided that, there's a transformation project, there a rollout of something. There might be, a new initiative from the organization, a new product line, whatever it might be. It might be growth perspectives, figures, KPIs, all of that is absolutely fine, and that can come top down, top management. But I think what is important is then that, just as I said, the smart sort of objectives and goals, is that we then have to boil that down to where does this department fit in, right? So until you know your own accountability to these goals, you don't really, it's very easy to point at others and say, okay, but we've done our part, they haven't done their part, for example. It's easier if it's not measurable. I think you need the transparent dashboards, you need the common goals, you need the common targets. That also, in one sense, then creates, a common direction for the organization. So that in itself is the criteria on which you can build cross-departmental collaboration, right? So let's say we try to make change happen in our organization. Then, of course, okay, let's say we need finance, IT, and production to be on board on this. Then I think it's ultimately the leadership that needs to share this common vision and be very transparent. Then I think we have to assign, specific projects, specific goals, and who is accountable for their parts towards these goals and how that breaks down. Because, we need that clarity and transparency to be able to, fulfill these criteria, right? So we understand, what's my role in this? What can I do? Then I think, as I said, this kind of nurturing a culture where these then stakeholders in this project meet regularly and actually have a place to unify around this change is something that is necessary. Otherwise, I think it's very easy that we sit in the silos, we keep the knowledge we have to ourselves, and it becomes almost like an infected marriage, right? It's like, oh, they should have known,
Okay.
And I don't think that's the best way of moving forward. So I think, and I'm a firm believer that a lot of knots can be untied by clear communication.
Very interesting point there, Lisa. And it was what really caught me was the phrase common direction. So
Yeah.
moving towards a common direction. So different roles, knowing what they're supposed to do. And you mentioned that it's very important to have these transparent dashboards. And I'm imagining that what you're pertaining to here could be, technology
Yeah.
as a solution, as something that could aid in doing in achieving this. So from your daily um, interactions with manufacturers and other larger organizations, what are some technologies you've seen that you think help to, streamline knowledge sharing within organizations?
Yeah. There's plenty, obviously. One way is, of course, I mean, I always say that technology should always be, reflected on as a tool, and it should be a tool that supports you in your, common objective, common direction, so it's something that helps you, enables you to move ahead or makes your life easier on the way, right? So that's technology to me. I think we should never look at the technology in itself as the actual solution to all our problem, because it's always going to be humans that deals with the technology, right? But what it does, it's that it's a great aid that we should lean on. And I mean, obviously AI has come quite a lot over the last couple of years. I said that I would be a millionaire if I could just, put $1 in the bank every time someone mentioned AI in our field of work, right? So then I could probably close down any other revenue streams and just, go happy on my AI dollars. But it is definitely something that is revolutionizing workflows, right? And it has this ability to read data quickly, which means that if we digitalize data, which is a big if, but when and if we digitalize, older data and records, for example, we will be able to capture and structure some of these, notes and extremely important aspects that might go lost afterwards, right? If they're not thoroughly read through. And AI is the best way of doing this. No human can keep up with that data flow and structure like that. Then you always need a human to sort of review your data and your algorithms, right? There's still a moral and, you know, human aspect that needs to be incorporated into this, right? But then we have things that comes to mind is, of course, you know, we have advanced CRM system today that really, you know, track our customer journeys. And I mean, the more we can sort of capture our customer behaviors and those small little nuances, the more we can, of course, excel in our commercial value proposition. And I think that's, again, you know, that's if we're fostering a culture where we want to do right by our customers, and we see this like transforming into more service economies, with the newer generation, people almost, you know, consume an outcome rather than a product. Then, of course, we need to know more about our customers. And our customers are often, at least here at Copperberg, when we say customers, we mean the B2B manufacturers' customers who are B2B manufacturers often, right? So the customers is both an actual entity as well as it is the individual representatives, right? So the more we can capture both from their, let's say, their objectives as a company, but also about the individual, like it's maybe the individual on the other end is a football mom that takes her 2 sons to practice every day, so there's not a good time to call her, you know. And you know, there are things that we need to know about our customers, and that our customers also expect that we know, because we have this fantastic ability to store data. So, you know, I get frustrated as a consumer now when I'm sometimes calling my service providers and be like, but how come you don't know this? You have all the data on me. How come you don't know this about me? So I think that kind of knowledge, sharing should automatically be fostered into that we should keep track of our customers. And that actually allows us to, of course, have that knowledge share on a customer level or an account level, right? Target accounts list or whatever it might be called. Then I have some of my favorite accidental recommendations, but I think it became true for many during the pandemic, is actually, you know, these kind of project management tools. Just to tell you the story, I mean, Copperberg obviously relied on a lot of remote workers, like yourself, Nina,
Yes.
during the pandemic. But it was also because if we go remote, we can also source any global talent, right? Which is brilliant. And, you know, we prefer talent over physical presence. So that was the direction we went in. But we quite quickly realized that, for example, me and my colleague Malin, who's our marketing director, we worked together for many, many years now. So, you know, we almost can fill in each other's sentences when we talk about our products and how we go to market with them, etc. But if we would just, you know, give up and move to Jamaica, that would be lost, right? There would be nowhere. But we have this clear idea of the process. It's so ingrained in our, you know, backbone almost, that it's seamless, to be honest. But it's not scalable because it was just with me and Malin, right? So what happened is that we realized we were taking on this bigger remote working group and extreme talent from across the world. And somehow now we have to make their, you know, tasks, their, you know, work description transparent, clear, measurable, all of that I was talking about. And I'm like, how do we do that? We need a project management tool. We opted for one called Asana, but you have the Slacks and whatever. And what it ultimately has done is that it's also forced us to structure all of these deliverables that we have into very defined processes. So we have somehow achieved process excellence just by relying on another tool. And now it's scalable. I can copy it. I can plug in anyone, anywhere into our processes because it's been done like 99 times since then, right? So now it's really refined and it's a very smooth kind of operation. And then it's a brilliant way of knowledge sharing because we just keep it and we just, you know, connect stakeholders in the different steps when needed. It's there after we're done. If we change a freelancer, we can plug them in. You know, it's very, very easy. And that's something I would recommend the listeners to have a look at, you know, if you work, especially cross-departmental, I would say. If you want to gather that knowledge and have that kind of interaction, it's a brilliant way of making sure that everyone knows what's expected of them, because there's a very true assigned and designated task function as well.
That's, what I find interesting about what you said is that we mentioned, field service, these are fast-paced
Yeah.
organizations. And
Yes.
Copperberg is also quite fast-paced with,
Very much so. Yes.
yeah, a lot of events, a lot of things happening, all at the same time,
Yeah.
overlapping timelines and all. So I can really see here how technology can aid in streamlining the
Hmm.
workflow. But again, like you said, it's really about humans, right?
Yeah.
And the people involved in it, and how people use Asana. Because sometimes, Asana is just a tool and it can get
Yeah.
messy when when it's not clear to people
Oh, yeah,
how
yeah.
how to use it, essentially.
Indeed.
So, yeah, before we shift gears to external sharing, which we will
Yeah.
do, and I think this is something that you are very familiar with in terms
Yeah.
of events and, the hybrid concept and everything. I just want to wrap this up in terms of,
Hmm.
knowledge exchange within the company. What makes an internal knowledge sharing strategy, if you like to call it as that, really
Hmm.
click? What should
Hmm.
companies focus on getting right first?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if it's a hen and an egg situation. I've seen both, to be honest. I've seen some
Mhm.
people invest in great technology first, and then by changing the technology and the infrastructure, you almost force people to go digital, right? And that is
Mhm.
in itself a little bit self-fulfilling, that you capture things digitally, right? That might be, depending on the size of the organization, might not be, the it's almost like a hostile takeover of people's, internet or computer infrastructure and what they're used to, right? But it could be a force of nature to do that in all manners. We did it once. We just had to move on to a fully digital solution on our corporate IT structure, and fully cloud based. And we just, overnight just changed everything and then made sure that people export and import into the right one. But we were a small company, and also had a very strong streak of agility and entrepreneurship in us, which we still do. So that was maybe somewhat expected from our colleagues, that we could do such a thing. Otherwise, I think it's what I started off saying. It really has to be, a way where you find collaborative reasons to engage with multiple stakeholders in your day-to-day business, to open up and kind of unlock, if that makes sense, that kind of collaborative spirit. I think it's really important that also sharing gets recognized, that we ask for people's, opinion and advice, because it's also, as you say, it's a little token of recognition and appreciation that we include them in conversation. So one shouldn't be really scared about doing that. I'm not saying everyone, you don't have to, have a town hall where everyone
Mhm.
has to speak. But I think in the daily encounters, it's important that we have a culture that incentivize sharing and ideas, because that leads to innovation as well.
Mhm.
And I think it's extremely important to hear those aspects, because it also builds understanding and empathy for your colleagues and what they're going through in their departments, right? So I mean, it has to be a collaborative spirit, and that must come from cross departmental communication.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's
So,
impossible. you know.
yeah, and all in the spirit of collaborative experience and sharing best practices, as we move on to talking about to moving beyond the walls of the
Yeah.
organization and out into the jungle. So there's always a line to tread when we, of course, share hard earned
Hmm.
best practices
Yeah.
with peers, with industry peers, or even
Hmm.
competitors who might
Hmm.
be there.
Yeah.
So how can companies navigate the balance between being open while also protecting what is their competitive edge?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great question. And to be honest, decade ago or so, I don't even remember, we had all these people coming to us and say, for example, you can't do a pricing event. No one is going to share about their
Mm,
pricing structure. That's secret information. No one is going to share if there is, like, competitors in the room, etc. I've heard this a gazillion times. Never has it been true. So it's also a matter of, it's all about balance, right? So you can share a lot without revealing the sensitive details, right? You can share how you transform the pricing structure and what led you to the need of transformation without revealing your exact pricing strategy or margins. So you can leave the specifics out, which I think it's something people often forget. And I mean, in many cases, companies are overly cautious, to be honest, because I mean, many of these organizations are listed companies. This is a lot of it is public information, whether they're doing good or bad. I mean, of course, don't reveal the nitty gritty, of course. But I mean, you can share a lot without going into the actual details. It's almost like a conversation with friends. You can share something, about your home situation, that paint with a broad brush about some kind of difficulties you might have, but you might want to leave the exact details out of it, right? And I think it needs to be regarded like that. And then I also believe that it's also a little bit of a brand awareness thing, right? So when you go to these events and they're filled with industry peers of your seniority, it's also your time to shine, not only from a brand perspective, but as a leader, for example. Who knows if your next employer might be in the crowd? Who knows if your next employee might be in the crowd, right? So you have to regard this as a great opportunity for you to position yourself and your organization and what you do. So, you have to look at your messaging there and say, okay, how much can I share? Now I'm speaking more also from the speaker perspective, but even in
Yeah.
the engaging roundtable discussions and etc., you never know
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
you're engaging with, right? So it's all of our interactions are great ways of positioning ourselves as industry representatives. So I think we're overly cautious at times, as I said, and I think people should embrace this more. And also I always say, if you've already done your transformation and you're sharing, how well it did for you and how well you've done after this, your competitors is in the room. If they actually learned something new there, they're so far behind you that
True. It's already done, and
it's
they
already
may not
done,
have the exact ingredients anyway.
No. The
Yeah.
train has left the station, right? So
Exactly.
you can probably brag about it, right? I would maybe not reveal those kind of details and exact numbers
Yeah.
mid project, but if you come back, let's say, oh, a year ago we started, and now here are the findings, right? And you have something concrete to actually share. I would say don't hold back. Do that, but of course, as always, make sure you think thoroughly, because there are mobile phones, there are recording devices, there are everything in these events. So we need to make sure that whatever we share is within the corporate communications guidelines, of course.
Yeah.
That's my only recommendation, right? But people are very rarely reckless when it comes to this. I think everyone on our stage, and also especially at the round tables, I would say, and in these in-person events, because they become almost like small workshops where we very much benchmark our own personal individual experiences and our challenges, and we like to say what's keeping the service leaders up at night. But I think those are often very much common denominators about technology, people,
Yeah.
processes. It's the same. They are very democratic, these issues. They don't disqualify anyone, right? They sneak into any corner of the society. So I think it's worth noticing that you can also sit next to your biggest competitor and actually find you have a lot in common when it comes to your current daily tasks.
I was really struck by what you said about the pricing community, because we know, and our listeners will know now, that
Yeah.
it's one of the most active, vibrant Copperberg community that we
Yeah.
have. So it went from being a very I don't know how to put this, maybe a bit cagey, a bit guarded
Mm-hmm.
community, to now being a vibrant one and a dynamic one with very interested people willing to share.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really a true testament of how industry events or conferences can be major platforms for
Yeah.
knowledge exchange. So, in your experience, recalling what it was like starting out the pricing event,
Yeah.
what made it a really effective platform?
I think it's a great question, and this is a fantastic example because it really showcased what this in-person event and communities can bring to the table. So when we started with the pricing event, I think it was 2013. I might be a little bit off there. Could be 14, but it feels like 13. And I started doing research on that topic. And then, of course, there's a few cornerstones to building an event. And the first event, it's also, of course, identifying your target audience, who would be the sort of the typical persona and delegate, your ideal candidate to attending this event, and who would be potential speakers, who would be potential sponsors, and so forth, right? There's a whole logic to this. And I mean, if you think about it, if you take like things like, the annual CFO summit, I mean, you have an abundance of CFOs to potentially research, engage with, different kind of channels. Pricing managers at that point, there was about 1,000 in Europe, which is a very, very, very tiny little universe. And I don't even think they had this homogenous title of pricing in their names. They just belonged to an association that was, focusing on pricing. So we knew by that criteria that they were regarding themselves as in charge of pricing. So we went to market and we had a fantastic event. But what I think is a little bit the ideal situation with this one, and actually showcase the strength of these kind of in-person, real valuable conversation, is that you don't meet these identical peers in anywhere else. The Copperberg events, but there are others out there as well. But I mean, these very dedicated events to specific topical questions, specific industries and verticals, makes it, even though they're small and they're very niched, it makes it also very valuable, because you can assume that everyone in the room is, facing the same, they have the same macro environment as you do. They are facing the same kind of challenges, and they belong to the same kind of industry vertical. So there's so many common denominators. You might go to trade shows, right? But there's thousands of people, and they might be great for future trends. And, there's a lot of press and your brand awareness and all of that. You get a lot of free pens, a lot of goodie bags, great
A lot
stuff.
of business cards too, right?
Exactly. Exchange a lot of business cards, and that's great.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's a huge need for these as well. Because I think that's also where everyone come and showcase their new sort of machinery, equipment, and all of these things that are shaping the future. But in terms of daily, workload, I think it's more useful to have, a conversation with someone who exactly identifies with the situation you're in.
Okay,
Even
so
though it's just a small twitch, like it's just a small discrepancy, but it's very much alike. And that's where the value comes.
Yeah, I can imagine that, and it's very inspiring listening to how pricing started, because I started when pricing was already a popular thing,
Yeah.
and it's almost no effort to promote the events. So I'd love to hear about a specific moment, like that, something that stuck with you, and maybe even inspired you as well. So,
Yeah.
have you ever had someone come up to you after an event and share something memorable about how attending really impacted their work?
I mean, I've had quite a few over the years. Obviously, now it's many years, and I mean, it's everything from people just being extremely happy and grateful over the fact that we keep on doing this year after year, right? I think also the change to the Power of 50 format post pandemic, which is way more focused around the knowledge and mind share. That is a deliberate move. I mean, financially, it doesn't really make any sense, because it's a capped format. But since it is or they make sense, but it's, if you compare it to the bigger events we used to run, of course, that was a totally different, numbers game. But I mean, I think it's about the community, and that's what we've kind of realized. So, I've had community members that's been to the event come up to me, thanking us because we let them come to the event, even though they were in between jobs and they found their new employer. And they are forever, grateful for that. I've had people that, when they, for example, there was quite a few during the pandemic, they were, let go. And they're one of the first things that comes to mind is, I need to call Lisa, see if she knows of anyone who's looking for someone. So there's obviously this, like, we do this impact, we have this impact on people, right? I've also had quite a few situations where people are asking me for my recommendation on different kind of solution providers.
Mm-hmm.
It could also be that in their current role, when they went to the event, they couldn't do anything. But then, a year after, they're in another organization and they want to, oh, by the way, can you help me? Which company was that that I, met at your event that did X, Y, Z? There's a lot of matchmaking behind, the scenes, if that makes sense as well. Senior leaders that want to continue the discussion. They form their own little sort of network afterwards and, bump into each other. We've even had people bringing their children, so the members of staff have been babysitting. So we've had a lot of fun. We've celebrated birthdays. So there's a lot of things there that goes into this mix, of course. But I think in general it's a very friendly environment that we've
Mm-hmm.
managed to create, and a lot of our community members, and that's also very good for us. I discussed that in the internal knowledge sharing before, is that many have gone to events by Copperberg since the beginning of time, right? When we our time at least, right? So they know the drill and they work as our ambassadors on site, and they help facilitate this format, which is also extraordinary to see. It's how self sufficient it is, and
Mm-hmm.
how when you put a certain amount of people with the same sort of seniority in one room, it's almost like magic happens. I'm hardly needed in the room, right? They take care of business themselves, and it's fantastic to see that vibrant vibe, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's something I'm a little bit like, every time I come from an event, like, okay, yeah, I can see this is good. So there's so many good stories, to be honest, from the event. And I always say that if we can help someone somehow, we would do our very best to give them the best of advice
Mm-hmm.
we can, right? Or match make them. It's a part of what we do, right? It's
Yeah,
karma, a good karma.
exactly. So good juju from the universe coming back in one
Exactly.
way or another.
Yeah.
So just to zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
and connect
Mm.
the dots, internal and external, before we wrap this up. So as you mentioned, pricing before was a big event with lots of attendees. It was a numbers game, and then it scaled
Yeah.
down to a capped format during the pandemic.
Hmm.
So it was from virtual out of necessity, essentially.
Yeah.
It became virtual out of necessity, and then now it's we have offerings that are both physical and also digital. So there's also the hybrid aspect to that. So,
Yeah.
and this whole shift, the pandemic is really as the catalyst for all of this, pushing us into
Hmm.
virtual spaces, asking us, pressuring us to adapt. How is this whole shift reshaping how we share knowledge, a broad view, both internally within teams and also
Hmm.
externally across, the industry, like for us,
Yeah.
for example, as events organizers?
Mm. I have first off, I need to tell the story about Copperberg during the pandemic there. I think I always sometimes thank my lucky star over the fact that we quite early on, we are, as I said earlier, we're a small agile team. We're quite loud. We have a high level of engagement. We're very quick in making decisions. We have a lot of interaction across the table, and this is kind of our forte, right? This is where we thrive as an organization, and it's really always been like that. And then the pandemic, of course, came with its own challenges for a team that had to downsize. Our team went from quite a big team to a fifth of its size or something like that, right? So it was definitely not fun times, and we were predominantly relying on physical events before. Now we, as you say, by necessity had to start
Mm-hmm.
doing everything that we did into virtual and digital offerings, right? So that was a forced move, something we're somehow is grateful, of today, because we learned how to do that by taking that, cold shower almost, and then here we are today. But what we realized quite early on, because we were, of course, like many other countries here in Sweden, we were asked to be at home, work remotely to the extent we could. So we did, but we decided to set up a virtual office. And now everyone is like, but literally it's a dial-in link that is open between 9 to 5. So it means we have a virtual setting, just much like you and I now, Nina. But it's just that we sit there with camera, we mute ourselves when we're not talking, but I still have this direct access to my colleagues, and I have this fast-paced environment. And we were on the verge of losing that by having structured calls and these kind of things, but they became like the only place where people who were so used to having this, engagement at their fingertips, those meetings that were dedicated for maybe an hour a day, they turned out to be 2 hour long, therapy sessions where everyone had to go through everything, and it wasn't really productive. So what we did is that we set up the virtual office instead. And I think that is a great testament to, depending on your organization, it's very hard to say where your knowledge sharing sits, right? For us, it is in the human interaction. So for us, that became extremely important. And the virtual space was another, we actually had tools to bridge that then, thankfully. I mean, thankfully, the pandemic wasn't like 15 years ago. This might not have been possible, right? But for us, that actually made us survive, I must say, and also be able to come stronger out of it. But I think it's a scary thing there with the virtual versus in person. I mean, there are certain qualities of life, the sort of work-life balance that we now also have been discussing more after the pandemic, I think in general. I think there are certain things, if you, for example, have young kids at home, that, if you cut down commuting and etc., it brings an additional layer of value. But there's also risk at hand. Like the reward is, the more time with family, but the risk is, of course, more isolation. So there needs to be some kind of balance to this, which I think is healthy to review, right? And it's not necessarily so that your employees or your fellow colleagues understand that isolation might be a risk, in the long run. And it might be a risk not only for them personally. We know that people don't do well when they're isolated too long. But it's like it's a health risk, right? Mental health risk in particular. But it's also that it might be a risk for the company, because you lose this knowledge sharing as a culture, right? You lose those kind of human interaction aspects. I think it's very important to also then maybe shift focus on what tasks are made when you work remotely, and what kind of maybe you can foster more interaction in the time when people are in the office, then to sort of make sure you're cultivating that aspect of your workforce. For the external knowledge sharing, I mean, what became clear in terms of being a conference organizer and an original content creator is that everything can be done online. It can be consumed by many online. If it's original content, it still has, a reason to exist, that's for sure. And in our niche, when we have this very dedicated and specific target audience and a very loyal community, we have still, still today, we have great numbers on our virtual broadcasts. So that's something that we're very happy of. But I mean, on the other hand, you lose that experiential aspect, that knowledge sharing that only occurs once, and also leaves a little bit more of a footprint in people's head, and that is in the in-person event, right? So I think it's the good things with the virtual technology is that any knowledge can be consumed from anywhere, and that's of course great. But I think some of the things can only be achieved when people meet people, and that's why there's a reason to exist for these physical events still. Unfortunately, there's still budget restrictions and travel restrictions for many companies. Again, probably a result of the pandemic, where we saw we didn't have to do all this traveling, actually. It wasn't necessary. It's not business critical. So there's a lot of reviews on that. But I think for anyone that can pick, some place only to go a year, I think they should focus their time on where they think that the personal exchange with other peers, where they have the most to gain. Trade shows and etc. Nothing wrong with that, again, but much of that will be covered by press. Much of that will be probably streamed, a big auditorium. You can see that from all over the world now. Normally these big shows have, live streams. but it is that small group exchange that is almost impossible to replicate in the virtual space.
Wow, so many inspiring things there to take away. So as we wrap up, Lisa,
Yeah.
what advice would you give to professionals, our listeners right now, who are hesitant to share their expertise?
I think it depends on if it's internal and external, but my ground rule, as I said again, is like, give a little, gain a little. So you have to be prepared to give and share to gain some insights, right? And it is really important that you set, your own boundaries by leading by example here. So when you engage in any conversation, whether it's internal or external, you set your own kind of framework for this, and you will sort of pave the way for how much the opposite side is going to be willing to share as well, right? No one is going to, or very rarely at least, and I hope not, is going to overshare if you have kept it at the minimum, right? So I think it's much of a dynamic that you need to yourself decide on when you go into any situation. And also, sharing information and not oversharing, but sharing enough information and transparent information and have this continuous flow is something that builds trust, right? So I think it's important that we keep that with us. And, my takeaway is, as always, we say at Copperberg that the great aim of education isn't knowledge, it's action. And I believe so. So to just, flip side this whole conversation of the importance of knowledge sharing, it's like knowledge isn't worth much unless we act on it, right? So I always say that knowledge is great, but we also need to do something with it. So and I stand by that. And it's also why we believe that these events of Copperberg and these forums are so important, because people share things they've done, actions that have worked, and that become knowledge for the opposite side that can then take that with them home and hopefully do the same thing.
Wow, thank you very much, Lisa. Such a lovely quote to end this
Thank you
whole
so much for
conversation.
joining us
And
today.
yeah, knowledge is something, but without action, it's absolutely nothing as well.
No.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Lisa, for coming today. Lots of nuggets there to chew on.
Yeah. Thank you, Nina, for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please like or follow us from wherever you're tuning in from. Got a topic you'd love us to cover next time? Or maybe you're itching to share your own insights as a guest? Drop us a line at podcast@copperberg.com. We'd love to hear from you. This is Copperberg Conversations on Manufacturing Matters. Until next time.